Good evening and welcome. I'm Sarah Miglio, Dean of Curriculum and Advising, and it's an honor for Wheaton College to host the Marc Chagall and Bible exhibition, now on display in the Billy Graham Museum Gallery. Our event this evening is part of an annual series that seeks to ask enduring questions and then explore faithful responses through a variety of liberal arts disciplines. Tonight, we will consider the question, why create art? What can art teach us? And we will explore those questions through Marc Chagall's life and work. We're not alone in our interest and appreciation of Marc Chagall. Ongoing interest in his work is due in no small part to his global experiences during the tumultuous history of the 20th century. He lived through many rapid and dramatic changes that set the trajectory of the 20th century, from the World Wars and the foundation of the Jewish state to intellectual currents such as fascism. Yet as Chagall watched these events unfold, he made sense of his rapidly changing context as he reflected on narratives and themes from the Hebrew Bible. As one biographer observed, Chagall found in the Hebrew Bible a presentation of the human story, a story that rejoined the many violent and destructive isms of the 20th century. And his work still invites reflection, especially in our own liberal arts community of learning. You will have the opportunity to hear more about Chagall in just a moment from each of our speakers, who I will now introduce. Our first speaker is Dr. Matt Lundin, Associate Professor of History here at Wheaton. He teaches courses on the French Revolution, the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, World War I, and the history of media. Much of his research has focused on 16th century Germany, exploring how ordinary people experienced the spread of printing and the Protestant Reformation. More recently, he's been researching the role of religion in the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic, the democratic period between World War I and the Nazi regime. His wife, Cherith, teaches painting, drawing, and printmaking here at Wheaton College in the art department. And thanks to her, he's enjoyed 2 decades of rich conversations about art and has had the opportunity to attend many exhibitions and lectures. And in fact, right now, even as we speak, Cherith is giving a lecture about her own art in the Chicagoland area. So he's both excited and a bit intimidated to be giving his own very first public talk about an artist. Next, we'll have Drew Bratcher, Assistant Professor of English at Wheaton. Originally from Nashville, he studied magazine writing at the Missouri School of Journalism and received his MFA from the University of Iowa. His essays have appeared in the Oxford American, Paris Review, Nowhere Magazine, and many other publications. Before teaching, he worked as a feature writer and assistant editor at the Washingtonian and was the founding editor of Ethno Traveler, an online magazine about world culture. He's currently at work on an essay collection about catharsis and country music. He lives in Wheaton with his wife, the writer Emily Helen Bratcher, and their 3 kids. We'll also be welcoming Marissa Voytenko. She's an abstract and caustic painter whose work explores relatable psychological themes through the framework of grids and squares, and I recommend that you look up her work online and visit an exhibition if you have a chance. She's the recipient of the Alden B. Dow Solo Exhibition Award from the Dow Museum of Art and Science in Michigan. She is represented by several galleries throughout the United States and has exhibited her work in Ukraine. Born and raised in Northern California, Marissa has traveled widely and lived for various stretches of time in Italy, Belgium, Austria, and Ukraine. She received her BA in art from Westmont College and a Master of Fine Art from Boston University. She resides in Chicagoland with her young family and is an adjunct professor of art here at Wheaton. And then we have Michael Graves, the Armourdine Professor of Biblical Studies at Wheaton College. He teaches classes about Old Testament, Judaism, and Hebrew. He received his PhD from the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. A primary interest of Dr. Graves' research is the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible by Jews and Christians in antiquity. He's the author of a number of books, including The Inspiration and Interpretation of Scripture, What the Early Church Can Teach Us. And in fact, Dr. Graves will be teaching a course on Judaism this upcoming spring semester, B-Quad, together with Rabbi Steve Bob, who is Rabbi Emeritus of the Congregation Etz Chaim in Lombard. Will you join me in welcoming our speakers tonight, and first, Dr. Lundin.
Thank you, Dr. Miglio. And thank you for coming out on this cold, first wintry night of the season. Tonight, I have the privilege and pleasure of being able to explore, just briefly, Marc Chagall's historical context. This is a daunting task because Chagall's context was as big as Europe and America itself in the 20th century. And I'll only be able to gesture at a few themes in the life of a remarkable artist. I'd be hard-pressed. I mean, it's really difficult to try to think of an individual whose life intersected with so many of the momentous events of 20th century European history. Chagall was in Paris on the eve of World War I. He was in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution. He found himself in Berlin during the turbulent 1920s and was in France during the Nazi invasion of 1940. We could devote a whole symposium, whole books to any one of these topics. So this is more of an invitation to continue to study Chagall's remarkable life. What makes Chagall's life and art so remarkable is that he witnessed these world-shattering events as a Jewish artist. For European Jews who had experienced centuries of persecution and discrimination within Christian Europe, the 20th century brought moments of hope, new prospects for freedom and equality. But the 20th century also gave rise to the Nazi regime and a murderous anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust. Marc Chagall navigated this tumultuous, tragic environment, often as an exile and a refugee. And his work, I would like to suggest, very much grew out of the creative tension between his Jewish identity, his Jewish past and childhood, and broader developments in European art, culture, and society. The earliest context that shaped Chagall's work was the Jewish world of his youth. Born in 1887 as Moshe Zakharovich Chagall, Chagall grew up in a shtetl, a small town within the Russian Empire. Chagall's hometown of Vitebsk was located in what was known as the Pale of Settlement, the only area in Russia in which Jews were authorized to live. During Chagall's childhood, Russian Jews experienced various forms of discrimination, including restrictions on education, mobility, land ownership, and political participation. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw growing violence in the form of pogroms, anti-Semitic riots that usually resulted in murder and destruction. Violence, persecution, and poverty prompted millions of Jews to emigrate to the Americas during this period, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But the shtetls were also home to tight-knit Jewish communities. Life in the shtetl is probably best known to American audiences through the musical Fiddler on the Roof, which drew its title from one of Chagall's most famous paintings. Chagall's own family was rooted in Hasidism, a movement within Judaism characterized by an intense mysticism, a sense of the presence of God in all things. Chagall grew up speaking Yiddish, only later learning Russian at school. And many of his early paintings captured everyday life in the shtetl, depicting rabbis, religious holidays, childbirth, weddings, funerals, beggars, butchers, animals, news sellers, and most famously, in an image you'll see in just a few minutes, violinists. Chagall returned to these themes again and again throughout his life. For instance, the clock that appears in some of the works in the show and is on the main image for the show harkens back to a grandfather clock in his family home that he often painted. As a young painter, however, Chagall was also eager to participate in the broader European art world. Leaving Vitebsk was difficult since the Russian government placed very strict quotas on the number of Jews who could move to cities. Chagall managed to make his way to St. Petersburg, and a few years later, he left Russia for Paris, the artistic capital of Europe, where he encountered the brave new world of avant-garde painting, including the cubism of Picasso and Braque, which broke with traditional forms of representation. Chagall's genius was to begin to fuse these modernist avant-garde forms with themes from his own childhood. The dual influence of Hasidic mysticism and modernist techniques gave his paintings during this period a surreal, almost hallucinatory quality. This is a beautiful painting based on earlier paintings Chagall had made of childbirth within a family, showing a mysterious figure tumbling out of the sky and signaling at a sort of mystical presence of God in this scene. And one of his most famous paintings, certainly you'll recognize, which is the painting of a violinist hovering above the wooden rooftops of Vitebsk. So Chagall was in Paris. In 1914, he returned to Russia for a visit, only to find himself caught in Russia because of the outbreak of World War I. He feverishly began capturing scenes from Jewish life in his paintings. This was a period at the beginning of World War I that was extremely disruptive for Jewish communities in the Pale, and he responded to it with paintings. In the paintings from this period, roofs flatten into abstract patterns. Rabbis take on bold, brilliant colors. And everyday scenes burst with spiritual energy, shattering into angular, dynamic shards. In many pieces from this period, Jewish beggars fly mysteriously through the town of Vitebsk. One common Yiddish term at the time for beggar was a Luftmensch, an airman, a person who subsisted on air. By interpreting this metaphor literally, by placing the figures literally in the air, Chagall gave them a mysterious and mystical significance that not only invoked traditional legends of the wandering Jew, but also recalled Chagall's own boyhood experiences waiting for Elijah during the Seder. Though Chagall didn't know it at the time, he was painting a community that within the next several decades would disappear. For Russia, World War I ended in 1917 with a revolution that overthrew the emperor, or czar, and brought a communist party, the Bolsheviks, to power. For Russian Jews, including Chagall and his new wife Bella, the revolution offered hope. Proclaiming equality for all, the new communist government removed all traditional restrictions on Jewish minorities, allowing them full access to education and governmental positions. The hope and excitement of this time, the utopian sense of possibility, is evident in many of the portraits Chagall painted of himself and Bella. During these years, Russia also became a center of avant-garde art and abstract painting. Chagall was appointed head of a new People's School of Art in Vitebsk, where he encouraged a diverse range of artistic styles and approaches. And at the same time, Chagall painted joyful murals for a new Jewish theater that opened in Moscow. And you can really see here the influence of abstraction and avant-garde artistic forms on his work. However, over time, Chagall grew disillusioned with the revolution. The Bolshevik government was openly hostile towards religion, and so while it offered full political equality to Jews, it also attacked synagogues and traditional forms of Jewish life. In addition, Chagall found himself pushed out of the Vitebsk art school by abstract painters who thought his art was too bourgeois, too conservative. And there were signs that the Soviet government was beginning to lose interest in artistic freedom, instead turning to increasingly heavy-handed forms of propaganda. So Chagall and Bella and his daughter Ida moved to Berlin in 1922, where he and Bella experienced the chaotic, tumultuous year of hyperinflation in Germany. Money became so valueless that bills were used as kindling and insulation. And Chagall himself was trying to recover money that he had earned in a show before the war in Berlin, only to find that the profits from that show entirely disappeared, and many of his works had disappeared at this time. Amidst this chaos, there were also signs of growing anti-Semitism. Chagall arrived in Berlin around the same time that Germany's most famous Jewish statesman, Walter Rathenau, was assassinated. Chagall quickly moved on to Paris, where he enjoyed a measure of peace and stability. But in the 1930s, he watched in alarm from France as the Nazi Party came to power in Germany and began to implement anti-Semitic laws and policies. In 1933, the Nazis burned books about his artwork and mockingly paraded one of his paintings on a cart. In 1938, the Nazis displayed some of Chagall's paintings in a racist exhibition of so-called degenerate art. This exhibition alleged that modern art undermined Western civilization, that it was the product of cultural decadence and decline, and that Jews were to blame. The fact that Chagall was both a Jewish and a modernist artist meant that the Nazis directed particular vitriol at his work. In the midst of these ominous developments, Chagall turned to the Bible and to Jewish history. In his paintings and etchings from the 1930s, he connected the experience of European Jews with the broader biblical story. The images from this period are intimate, full of emotional tension, and yet also mysterious, evoking both the landscapes of Palestine, which Chagall visited in the 1930s, and his memories of the shtetl. Chagall's art from this period also witnessed to something that many Europeans in the 1930s were in a rush to forget: that Christians and Jews shared the same scripture and that Jesus was Jewish. Chagall had previously painted Christ as a representative of Jewish suffering, and if we had time, we could have a whole hour-long lecture on Chagall's depictions of Christ. But his paintings of the crucifixion took on new urgency in the 1930s. Protestants in Germany, some Protestants in Germany, sought to purge the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, from the Bible, the Christian Bible. They argued that Jesus was not Jewish, but rather a, quote, Aryan hero. In 1938, the Nazi regime carried out a violent pogrom against Jewish communities in Germany, Kristallnacht, destroying Jewish synagogues and burning Torah scrolls. In response, Chagall painted a crucifixion scene, which you can see at the Art Institute, one of his most famous paintings, in which Jesus, clothed in a prayer shawl, is surrounded by scenes of the persecution that was at that very moment happening in Europe. And here Chagall inverted the traditional anti-Semitic accusation that Jews were, quote, Christ killers, something that had dates back to the Christian Middle Ages, and argued that, and showed in this painting that it was Nazis and Christians who, by persecuting Jews, were also persecuting Christ. Chagall himself barely escaped the Holocaust. In 1941, through the intervention of American art collectors, he and Bella secured a visa to emigrate to the United States. And they escaped France in 1941, when some of the first roundups were beginning. Later that same year, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union and murdered the Jews of Vitebsk, along with men and women in thousands of Jewish communities throughout Eastern Europe. After World War II, Chagall returned to Europe, settling in France. It was there that he returned to his work on the Bible, though now in a very different context. European audiences after the war were hungry for ecumenical art, and Chagall's images met a deep spiritual need. His biblical prints and stained glass windows seemed to contemporary audiences to capture universal Judeo-Christian themes. And you will encounter several of these works from this period in the current exhibit, and I know subsequent speakers will talk about them. And if you look attentively at these images from the 1950s and the 1960s, you will also see how much Chagall's own history as an artist and as a Jewish artist and a refugee, a man who experienced the hope and the deep tragedy of 20th century American history, shaped his response to the biblical stories.
Thank you, Dr. Lundin. I learned so much. I did not know that term airman. I've been wondering about that my whole life, you know, looking at these works. Let's see here. So I have had two experiences with paintings by Marc Chagall, which I'd like to tell you about now, in the hopes that you might have your own experience with the work on display here in this building. As a writer, when I think about art, I think about the experience of art. I say experiences with paintings by Marc Chagall, but the first was an experience not with a painting, but with a print of a picture of a Chagall painting. See, I grew up just outside of Nashville, and perhaps like many of you, my first experiences with visual art did not come from standing in front of canvases in museums or galleries. There weren't many of those in the Nashville of my childhood, although I did occasionally hear tell of impressive private collections in certain homes near the country club. But my experiences rather came from looking at reproductions of paintings in books and on walls in poster form. Whatever Walter Benjamin's very legitimate concerns about art in the age of mechanical reproduction, I was and remain grateful for mechanization, without which I would have had very little exposure to art at all. Well, as it happened, the halls of my elementary school in the hills north of Nashville, were lined with frame prints of early 20th century paintings, the pet project of an art-loving principal who was also, among other things, a great world traveler, often picking up volumes of poetry along her journeys and inscribing them to students. Well, among the many prints that the principal had hung in the school hallway was one by Chagall called I in the Village, which was painted in 1911, when Chagall was in his mid-20s, and in which scenes from village life wheel across a kind of polychromatic dreamscape. It's a strange picture. Nothing is quite where it should be. The characters are earthy, low down, and yet the picture irradiates a kind of weightlessness. A man with a green face and wide eyes holds a little tree of life. There's a woman milking a goat on a cow's cheek. In the background, a woman in a blue skirt stands on her head, a kind of yin to the yang of a peasant shouldering a scythe. In his memoir, My Life, Chagall attributes his inverted vision, on display in this painting, to an answered prayer. I roamed the streets, he writes there, and prayed, God, thou who hidest in the clouds or behind the shoemaker's house, grant that my soul may be revealed. I want to see a new world. As if in reply, the town seems to snap apart, he continues, like the strings of a violin, and all the inhabitants, leaving their usual places, begin to walk above the earth. For all its rapt bizarreness, I felt a connection almost immediately to I in the Village. You see, I was what you might call a country boy, well acquainted with livestock and tools with wooden handles. My people dealt in cattle, among other dusty and rusty things, which is to say the characters in the Chagall were more recognizable to me than, say, the dancers in the Degas a little further down the hall, and I didn't know what to do with the Kandinsky or the Mondrian. It is a liberating thing, fortifying really, and slightly unnerving to find traces of your own experience, however faintly, in a framed work of art. But it wasn't only the figures I resonated with in that Chagall print. More than anything, it was the spirit of the painting. Of course, in the 4th or 5th grade, whenever it was, I would not have had the vocabulary to articulate such thoughts. But I think I sensed, as I walked by I in the Village, en route to class, or had occasion to tarry in front of it while waiting in line to go to the gym, something of Chagall's fraught relationship with his home turf. There was adoration in the Chagall, and there was also revulsion. There was nearness, and there was distance. There was red, and there was green. The artist loved this place he was painting. He loved these people, even as I suspected he wasn't one of them, or had at least chosen to walk a different path than them, and that his village was in fact the canvas. Was I beginning even then to suspect something similar about myself, that maybe I wasn't a country boy like my dad or grandfather had been? Was I, like the painter, longing to see a new world? I doubt it. I was very young. Deep down, though, in whatever place inside of us archives those early impressions, I made note. My second experience with a Chagall happened many years later. By and by, I had left the country and moved to Washington, D.C. in pursuit of a career in writing, a career that had on occasion given me the chance to write about art. I'd gotten married. In fact, I'd been married for a year, almost to the day, when my wife and I took the short train ride from D.C. up to New York to celebrate our first anniversary with a visit to the Museum of Modern Art. It had been a hard year. This was the fall of 2009. Great recession. Like so many writers, Emily and I had suddenly found ourselves without magazines to write for, as one by one they dwindled to pamphlets of their former selves or folded altogether. We were worried. We had aged. We were shaken up. Money was short and getting shorter. We'd even had to move into the apartment that Emily's mom lived in. We had assumed a certain set of circumstances when we'd said our vows a year earlier, but in a year's time, the facts had changed dramatically, possibly irrevocably, and we weren't sure what we were going to do. And the upheaval had sent shocks through our marriage. We loved each other, we'd entered into a covenant before God, but we were sad and confused, defeated, together, but drifting apart. Art museums had been central to our relationship. Our first date, which of course neither of us had realized until afterwards was our first date, had taken place in a museum. And during our engagement, there was seldom a weekend that didn't involve a trip to the National Portrait Gallery or the National Gallery of Art or the Renwick. Paintings, we had always found, gave rise to ideas, triggered memories, raised big questions, which we'd try to articulate to each other before moving on to other paintings. But now, as we wandered past the Picassos and the Pollocks and MoMA's airy galleries, we did not have much to say. Museums, it seemed, had been part of the old dispensation, when life was steady and the future seemed bright. It had been a bad move, I thought, to visit a museum on our anniversary. It was only a reminder about how our lives used to look. It's a special kind of despondency, the kind that resists transcendence at every turn. And then we rounded a corner. In my mind, it was to the right, maybe up a flight of stairs, and there on the wall was Chagall's The Birthday. Now, I had seen reproductions of The Birthday in books. It's one of those paintings whose reputation precedes it. It's an image many of you have seen, even if you haven't ever seen it, because of the way it has passed into the culture like a powerful idea, becoming a touchstone in film, in literature, in life itself. But as Emily and I approached the painting, arms crossed, still not talking, it was as if I had never seen it before. Two lovers, stunned into a kind of composed rapture, were levitating in an apartment flat, looking as if they might just float right out the window. There's a story about T.S. Eliot visiting the Sistine Chapel. Someone in Eliot's party, realizing that the poet was no longer among them, asked, "Where's Tom?" At which point they turned around and found Eliot on his knees in the entryway of the chapel, staring up at the ceiling, his face all agog. This wasn't Rome, and I hadn't dropped to my knees, but inside I was reeling. The biographies tell us that this painting depicts Chagall and his fiancée Bella on the occasion of the painter's 28th birthday. Although they were engaged, Chagall hadn't told Bella his birth date, but she'd done some investigating and concocted a plan. He was alone in his apartment, not expecting visitors, perhaps worrying over Bella's parents, who were opposed to their wealthy daughter's relationship to the poor painter, when she surprised him with flowers, cake, and shawls with which to decorate his gray, meager room. She brought beauty into the bleakness, recognition into his quarantine, and Chagall was taken aback. So striking was the event that, according to a remembrance that Bella wrote, he began the birthday right then and there, as if the moment were too precious, too meaningful to let slip away. And what a moment it was. I suddenly felt as if I were taking off, Bella recounts in that remembrance. You too were poised on one leg, as if the little room could no longer contain you. You soared up to the ceiling, your head turned down to mine, and turned mine up to you, brushing against my ear and whispering something. The painting, like the moment that inspired it, is about surprise, about what happens when you're expecting one thing and then confronted with another. And the utterness of this particular surprise gives it, simultaneously, an urgency and an equipoise. It's about grace, in a way. Grace as a gravity-defying gift that keeps giving when it is registered as such in memory and in paint. When Chagall finished The Birthday, shortly before he married Bella in 1915, did he know anything of the struggles that would follow? Did he realize that they would have dire need to be reminded of that moment in the days ahead, when their life together became a life on the run, as Russia and Europe became increasingly inhospitable and then homicidal to Jewish artists like Chagall? Whatever the case, in painting after painting, again and again, he would return to this motif of he and Bella in flight, bringing it forward even as he looked back. We carry, every one of us, fragments of the past into the future, and the attempt to reassemble them, to project them in another pattern, in music and art and writing, to preserve and pass on what we've left behind, is as fundamental to our experience, perhaps even to our survival, as the leave-taking itself. Why art? That's our question. How do we measure its value? What is it for? Well, this particular work of art did not in any verifiable way solve my problems, right my wrongs. In fact, more upheaval was on the horizon, moves around the country, kids, career changes. But what I know is that as I stood there beside my wife in the museum on that fall day in New York, I felt myself moving toward her again, possessed of a sudden with something like promise, like renewed faith. And we did not go airborne, but it was a moment of grace all the same, of suspended motion, that like the painting before us became an instant memorial, what the scriptures call an Ebenezer, something you return to find the courage to go on. Thank you.
Thank you, both Dr. Lundin and Dr. Thatcher. I'm humbled to be here. I wish I could sit down with Marc Chagall over a cup of tea and listen to him talk about his life, his work, and his view of the world. The more I read about him and look at his work, the more I see him as a wise teacher that has much to share. And as an artist, I crave these interactions. One thing that I find the most inspiring about Chagall is his view of himself as an artist. Chagall had a deep sense of calling to create, and he describes his first interaction with art like a vision. He says, "In our little old provincial ghetto, among the petty traders and craftsmen that my family knew, we had no idea of what it means to be an artist. But one day in grade school, I saw one of my classmates busy reproducing and drawing a magazine illustration. And as I watched, I was completely dumbfounded. To me, this experience was like a vision, a true revelation in black and white. I asked him how he managed such a miracle." Almost every person who considers themselves an artist has one of these transformative experiences. When I was 6 years old, my aunt gifted me with a set of colored pencils. And when I received the colored pencils, it was a life-changing moment. These were not just Crayola crayons meant for coloring books. This was a set of 24 beautiful hues that had names which I could not pronounce, and colors that I had never seen before. And at that moment, I knew without a doubt I was called as an artist. I was called to create. But Chagall's calling is not simply about passion and creativity. He regarded the artist as a messenger. To be called an artist, he felt, was a divine calling. That the artist has the role of a revealer, a person who receives truth and delivers the message in visual language. In the painting The Apparition, the artist is seated in front of an easel and is interrupted by an angel who delivers a message to him. Chagall is doing something really important here. This painting is reinterpreting the traditional religious subject, the Annunciation, where Mary is visited by Gabriel. Gabriel, of course, shares with Mary that she would bear the Christ child. Mary is a vessel through which the unseen God is made flesh, God that is seen. Similarly, Chagall receives truths and fleshes them out in his work. In his view, the artist is not just a maker, but a maker with divine purpose. In other paintings, Chagall puts wings on the back of the artist, reinforcing the concept of the artist as messenger or interpreter. Art historian Jean-Michel Fauré notes, "It is important to understand that Chagall's representation of the artist as prophet has dual significance. In one sense, this concept, central to religious art of the Renaissance, posits the artist as bearer of a message that he does not originate. However, for Chagall, the notion of the painting as messenger was also a metaphor for his own practice, one that allowed him to claim some authority as the creator of his paintings." To deeply understand this and claim this role as an artist takes guts. It's not easy to hold on to this belief confidently while putting your art on display for all to see and critique. I myself often doubt and sometimes feel if my work might be redundant or relevant or necessary. Creating artwork that has specific social, political, and religious messages can be even more intimidating to create because they can be very divisive topics. Chagall experienced much opposition to his work. He was the eldest of 9 children and had pressure to contribute to his family's needs, and painting was probably not considered responsible work. He also faced opposition and misunderstanding from his religious community, who did not understand how a Jew could create graven images, especially ones that contained the crucifixion. His calling must have been nearly unshakable because he pressed into his work with even more fervor while he was living and working in Paris before World War II. And at that time, all the work by Jewish artists was considered degenerate, a term given by the Nazi Party, and was taken from galleries and museums and destroyed. Yet his message could not have been more bold, as he painted swastikas in the same painting as the Star of David. Another reason I find Marc Chagall so fascinating is his ability to weave together his life experience, heritage, and the tastes of popular culture into a style of work that was completely his own. In art terms, this style is called visual language. It's a system of communicating using visual elements. When an artist uses a combination of particular elements like a certain color palette, a kind of brushstroke, specific shapes or forms or concepts repeatedly in their work, we can recognize their language and therefore their work. For instance, when we see a giant canvas covered with spattered paint, we think, oh, that's a Jackson Pollock. We recognize the visual language and attribute it to him or her. There are a number of elements in Chagall's work that give us clues that these are his works. And I'm going to go through several slides here, and I want you to note the visual elements in his work. Look at color palette, line, composition, and ask yourself what is repeating in his work. So I'll just spend a few seconds on each. So feel free to shout out. What sorts of things are you seeing in his work?
Horned animals.
Say that again.
The horned animals.
Horned animals, thank you. What else? Bright colors, thank you, yes.
A focus on the center.
Good, okay, a focal point in the center of the painting.
Strong contrast colors.
Yeah, very good. Strong contrasting colors. Anything else? Good, I'm glad somebody mentioned the bright colors. That is one thing that we might notice right away. He uses a lot of primary colors, so reds, yellows, blues. I might even go back because this isn't the best example. That might be a better example. It's difficult to say for certain why he chose these colors, but some have said it's because he was influenced by the Fauve art movement that was popular during his time. The Fauve artists valued individual expression, intuition over academic theory, and separating colors from their traditional associations. And this explanation would certainly fit with Chagall's ideals. But I also think that these eye-catching, dramatic colors fit with his experience as a set designer. A couple other visual elements we might notice is the sweeping motion of the subjects, and in contrast with this, a flat background. The upward angle of movement also creates a dramatic effect, and the background that lacks atmospheric perspective or depth acts like a curtain or a flat backdrop, and may also be linked to his work with the theater. In addition, we consistently see, as somebody had said earlier, the subjects again and again, like the rooster, the goat, or the horned animal, an angel, the artist, among others. And the animals were most likely things that he had seen in his village growing up. The angel would have been something he read about in the Bible, but we also know that he studied Christian images, and he no doubt visited cathedrals when he lived in St. Petersburg and in Paris. The way he creates figures seem to me like cutout drawings that are put on popsicle sticks, like puppets that are acting out a drama before us. And I don't say this in any way to simplify or demote his work. Rather, I'm trying to emphasize his ability to draw from his life experiences and use those to create a unique voice. Chagall did not adhere to any one artistic school of thought. Instead, he borrowed their ideas if they worked for his purposes. He always straddled two worlds, that of the avant-garde, that which was popular at the time, and the world of his childhood and his heritage. And his ability to do so makes his work deeply meaningful and effective in communicating with a wide audience. And this is the wonderful thing about art, and abstract art in particular. It can communicate different messages to different people because art speaks where words often fail. This is an image of one of my paintings from a series of work I created based on the refugee crisis. I've created many paintings with the symbol of boats, which represent the journey or plight of the refugee. Once someone saw my work and shared how moved she was, and then said, "These are bowls, right?" And she went on to tell me that she thought of them as symbols of starvation and hunger. And while this wasn't exactly what I was trying to convey, the imagery spoke to her, and she found the interpretation meaningful. Just as art has the ability to offer different messages to different people, art has the ability to move beyond time. Because art evokes in the viewer what is important to them, it continues to be relevant. For instance, a Jewish person looking at the painting of the white crucifixion in 1938 would notice the tallit, or the prayer shawl, around Jesus' waist, his forelocks, the people in the boat trying to escape. And this scene might remind them of the pogroms, the attack on the Jewish villages in Russia during the turn of the 20th century. But another viewer looking at this work today might see this scene and think about our current worldwide refugee crisis. And this is not meant to say that the artist's original intentions are not important or are to be disregarded. Instead, I believe art gives us the opportunity to think both critically and introspectively. This evening, I would encourage you to look at Chagall's work and reflect on what you know of his story and see what connections you might find in life today. I'd like to conclude with the words of Marc Chagall himself and his reflection on the meaning and purpose of his work. He says, "To my way of thinking, these paintings do not illustrate the dream of a single people, but to that of mankind. It is not up to me to comment on them. Works of art should be able to speak for themselves." Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have enjoyed so much hearing and seeing all of this tonight, so thank you very much. My segment of this evening will focus on how Chagall's pictures on biblical themes tell stories from the Bible in a way that reflects his Jewish background and experience. The first picture on the screen is a detail from David with his harp. Let me offer this warning. I am not an expert interpreter of art. I have read studies on Chagall. I have some general sense of his context, but I am certain that I am missing more in these paintings than I am seeing. I approach Chagall from the vantage point of the history of biblical interpretation. Now, I understand that Chagall is not expounding Jewish doctrines in these paintings. One sees in his work universal themes expressed through images that include multiple facets of the heritage of Western art, including Greek mythology and Christian images. At the same time, Chagall's paintings contain many symbols taken from the Russian Jewish world of his upbringing and multiple recurring Jewish motifs and characters. For just a few examples, let us consider how the tradition of Jewish biblical interpretation and 20th century Jewish experience shed light on some pieces of Chagall's art. First, here on the right side is a picture that is part of the present exhibit, Moses receiving the tablets, from the 1956 Verve series. Chagall's corpus contains several depictions of Moses receiving the tablets at Sinai. This does not surprise us, since the revelation of Torah at Sinai functions in Jewish thought as the pinnacle of God's revelation to humanity. God coming down to give Torah from heaven is the epicenter of divine human contact. To the left, I have a scene, the creation of Adam, from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, which serves as a useful parallel to Chagall's picture. In the Michelangelo scene, notice how the divine and human connect in the act of creation. This makes sense in a Christian thought universe where God and human meet in the second Adam, namely Jesus, who for Christians is the epicenter of divine revelation. In Jewish tradition, the giving of Torah at Sinai is a more fitting subject for reflecting on divine human contact. In his book, Torah Min HaShamayim, Heavenly Torah, Rabbi Abraham Heschel states, quote, "Torah's source is heaven, not earth. It is not simply a book possessed by Israel with words written on parchment residing in a holy ark. The concept developed that Torah had not only a heavenly source, but a heavenly essence as well." According to classic Jewish texts, the tablets of the commandments were created from heaven, having been written in the first 6 days of creation and set aside until the Jewish people were ready for it at Sinai. In Chagall's picture, notice that God and Moses do not actually touch, but are in contact through Torah. Still, we may ask, where is Moses in this scene? It is worth noting that some Jewish authorities understand that Moses actually ascended to heaven to receive the commandments. This event is understood to be alluded to in Psalm 68:19, "You ascended to the heights and you took spoils. Compare the Christian reading of that psalm in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 8, connected to Jesus. Okay. Here we go. Here is another one of Chagall's depictions of this remarkable theme: Moses receiving the tablets of the law. A few comments on this piece. Heavenly hands come out of the clouds to give the tablets to Moses, who is among dark rocks. The Midrash says that Israel was like a dove in the clefts of the rock when it received the Torah, Song of Songs 2:14. Here, beneath a red bird and under some kind of golden archway, the Jewish people stand in awe and wonder as participants in this event. Although it is hard to see in this view, hidden in the rock below and to the right of Moses is a Jew holding a Torah scroll. This makes sense, as in Jewish thought, Torah study places one in contact with the Sinai revelation, such that insights found in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and even insightful questions from students engaged in Torah study, can all be credited to the Sinai revelation. Also hidden in the rock, to the lower left of Moses, are two figures embracing who look like characters from other Chagall paintings. Perhaps other regular people, or perhaps the artist himself was somehow also present at Sinai. Here we go. Another key Sinai moment is when Moses breaks the tablets after the incident with the golden calf, as depicted by Chagall in this color lithograph. Let us briefly notice just a few elements in this picture. Moses is in the center with glowing horns coming out of his head, which appears to be a construal of a traditional Western motif. There are people near the golden calf on the right side, some at the bottom venerating the calf, but others near the top, perhaps ready to receive the Torah. On the left side, there is a couple being married under a canopy, which is held up by a floating figure. In Jewish tradition, God's covenant with Israel at Sinai is construed figuratively as taking wedding vows. Note that Moses' hands are in the air, and he looks dismayed, but the tablets on the ground are not actually broken. There's a lot happening in this picture, more than I probably am able to explain. Let me mention one issue. Exodus 32:19 says that Moses became angry and cast the tablets from his hands and broke them. However, the biblical text does not say that God told him to do this. What was Moses' motivation in breaking the tablets? Was he justified in doing so? The medieval commentator Rashbam suggests that Moses lost his strength at the sight of the disobedient Israelites and merely dropped the tablets. Abraham ibn Ezra says that Moses was angry like a jealous husband who tears up the marriage contract after he sees that his wife has been unfaithful. In another tradition in the Midrash, Moses breaks the tablets in order to save Israel from the punishments that would follow from being obligated to commandments that they appear unable to keep. This is likened to a king's steward who tears up a marriage contract before it takes force in order to save the life of a woman whom the king had planned to marry, when the steward finds out that she had already had sexual relations with another man. I am not sure how to interpret this version of Chagall's breaking of the tablets, but the marriage motif signals that something broader is at play, and it is worth recognizing that Jewish tradition offers lively discussion about this incident. Okay, a couple more. Next is another image from the present exhibit here, Joshua and the Rock of Shechem, from the Bible series. According to Joshua 24, Joshua made a covenant with the people at Shechem, where he set up a stone to serve as witness of the covenant. And he, quote, wrote these words in the book of the Torah of God. In the Talmud, Joshua is said to have written the last 8 verses of Deuteronomy, according to one view, and he was seen as a great sage of Torah who never departed from the tabernacle, studying Torah, Exodus 33:11, where he studied constantly and the words of the Lord never departed from his mouth, Joshua 1:8. In this picture, we see Joshua expounding from a book which looks sort of like tablets, and he is standing in front of the witness stone from the biblical text, which bears a Star of David, marking this as a covenant renewal for the Jewish people. A remarkable feature, already noted, of Chagall's work is the central place he affords to crucifixion scenes. This can be surprising, as noted, to some Jewish viewers because the crucifixion form seems to be so Christian, and it can be surprising to Christian viewers when they see how Chagall makes use of the form. As Aaron Rosen notes, Chagall saw Jesus as a great poet whose poetical teaching had been forgotten by the modern world, and also as a true type of the Jewish martyr. The picture on the left, Christ and the Clock, is one of the miscellaneous paintings in this Chagall and the Bible collection. I cannot say that I have had an easy time understanding this painting. In her 1985 book on Chagall, Susan Compton refers to the artist's, quote, unlikely juxtapositions and illogical pictures. In trying to understand this work, I was both comforted and perplexed by one scholar's reference to, quote, the mysterious animals whose exact meaning in Chagall's private mythology escapes us. As an interpreter, I'm always asking, what does this mean? And sometimes probably to an excess when I'm looking at art. This painting is worth deeper consideration, but here are a few things that strike me. There are suffering people in the background, including a woman carrying a child, which speaks of deportation or forced migration. There is a man lying down holding a book, probably a Jew, maybe the artist. The horse flying above is carrying a broken menorah. The crucified figure is within, and in fact part of, a grandfather clock, alluded to earlier by Dr. Lundin. Consider that detail as well alongside this quotation from Chagall from right after the end of the Second World War. Quote, "Now is the time. No world conference will be successful until the Jewish people are taken off the cross on which they were crucified for 2,000 years." End quote. The fish swinging right like an upside-down pendulum is something of a mystery to me. But I read that Chagall's father worked a difficult job in the fish trade, and so this could also evoke long-standing suffering in some way. On the right side, the image before us is a picture that Chagall painted in 1944 called The Crucified. It is winter and dark in a little village, perhaps like the village that Chagall knew in his youth. The victims, crucified all down the street, as you see, are Jewish. Before leaving crucifixions, I would like to look again at the white crucifixion from still another angle. Here, as previously noted, Jesus wears a loincloth made from a Jewish prayer shawl. Above him in Latin, but just in abbreviations, INRI, is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And then in full, written in Aramaic, Yeshua Hanotzri Melcha da Hayudaye, same thing, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The Aramaic is the language of the Talmud. Images of distress surround the cross. In the top right corner, a synagogue is being burned. In the bottom corner, a Torah scroll is burning, so it seems. I'm aware of there's a Yiddish folktale apparently about a scroll that somebody was trying to destroy, and the scroll emitted some sort of light or energy that protected the scroll. I've heard somebody allude to this in reference to this painting. Otherwise, it looks like it's burning with destruction as much else in the scene is. A man with a sack flees to the right. A woman with child flees at the bottom. And in the bottom left, men are hurrying away, one with a Torah scroll, and the other wearing a sign, which, according to an article I read, at the pre-colored stage actually read, "I am a Jew," bottom left corner. Unlike Christian depictions of Jesus' crucifixion that have grieving people waiting below the cross in many cases, in Chagall's picture, the people at the base of the cross are all fleeing. They're being chased off. In the top left, a mob carrying flags is rushing in to destroy a Jewish village. And below that, still on the left side, is a boat, already noted, filled with people, some screaming and shouting. Perhaps they are escaping. Some are pointing back to the crucified figure as if to ask, why is this happening? and that could perhaps be taken in different senses. Above the scene are 4 floating figures, perhaps 3 patriarchs and a matriarch, who all appear to be grieving. At the bottom center is a lighted candelabrum, as from the temple. I'm not sure if this is meant to be hopeful or not. Much more could be said, but the painting is deeply sad to look at and challenging to think about. Finally, one final slide. The sacrifice of Abraham or Isaac. This is part of the Bible series for this show. In keeping with Jewish tradition, Abraham is depicted as quite elderly, and Isaac is old enough to have made his own decision in this matter, such that focus falls not only on Abraham's faith, but also on Isaac's obedience and willingness to be sacrificed. This biblical narrative, called the Akedah, literally binding in Hebrew, it's called the Akedah in Jewish tradition, came to play a major role in liturgy, for example, in connection with the sounding of the shofar, the ram's horn, on Rosh Hashanah, and also in theological reflection. In some creative homilies in the Midrash, it is imagined that that Isaac actually did have his blood shed at the Akedah, or that God spared Jerusalem in 1 Chronicles 21 because he saw the blood of Isaac's binding, or that in the future God will revive the dead by the merit of Isaac, who offered himself on the altar. This strikes me as a potentially useful way of thinking about the connection noted by Benjamin Harshav between Chagall's sacrifice of Isaac and earlier Christian representations of the Pietà form. I hope that this has been helpful, this biblical background material and Jewish history background material. Again, I'm sorry that my knowledge of the art history side is not deeper. I have very much enjoyed hearing all of our presenters this evening. I hope that this material that I presented can also contribute to your greater appreciation of the exhibits and the artwork that you'll see. And I hope that you will go and see these pieces of art. And I'd like to ask Dr. Miglio to come up and see us off.
I want to say thank you to Matt Lundin, Drew Bratcher, Marissa Voytenko, and Michael Graves for helping us comprehend through all of these very distinct and unique disciplines, right? History, literature, art, and the history of interpretation and biblical studies, how art helps us make sense of the world around us in ways through visual language, right? In ways that words don't necessarily capture or express. And it's in those moments and those encounters that we may come to a place of greater self-understanding, a better sense of vocation and calling, or a sense of something bigger than us. And so with those thoughts in mind, I'd like to invite you to, as you leave, you'll exit the auditorium, and to your left, you'll find the exhibit on display in the BGC gallery, along with a reception of hors d'oeuvres and desserts to celebrate the opening night of Marc Chagall in the Bible. Thank you.